My name is Emma Steen, and I am the curator of the show Taking Space for Self-Care in Urban Centers here at Collision Gallery as part of ArtworxTO Year of Public Art. And I'm joined with two of my favorite people, Susan Blight and Grier, two absolutely fantastic, talented artists based here in Toronto. In 2020, when I shared this, my idea, I should say, to ArtworxTO, and they were doing their call for curators. It was, of course, like quite deep pandemic. We were in the second wave, and I think that care and the need for care as like a human right was really highlighted in 2020. Definitely in my work with the Indigenous Curatorial Collective, we were talking about care a lot as our community members were losing work, as folks were getting priced out of their homes in the city, as encampments were popping up. When I approached both of you and kind of shared my idea for the show and really thinking through how self-care is actualized, yeah, both of you stood out as like folks I like needed to work with. And also people who I just think are so cool and wanted to make sure that you guys liked me more. So it's also a trick. Susan, you actually mentioned something to me yesterday, which I thought was so interesting. And I was just wondering if you might like elaborate a little bit more on your thinking through authenticity, self-care, and the work that you brought in.
You know, that conversation that we had to do with the form of the work that's in the gallery, meaning there's photographs of plants and there's actual plants. So there's the actual being, you know, the non-human being of the yarrow plant, but there's also the representation of the yarrow plant. And so that, to me, when you introduce photographs or images, there's a question brought into the gallery about what's real and what isn't, and what does the representation mean, or the image mean, and what does the real, actual non-human being in the gallery mean. And so when it comes to that question of authenticity, in many ways, Indigenous peoples have been positioned within the colonial imaginary as continually and always associated with the wild or with rural areas, areas outside of urban centers. I think it's starting to change, but I think it still is that way in many ways. We are constantly, as Indigenous people, trying to figure out how we exist in this state, you know, how we exist in the face of ongoing genocide and the policies that facilitate that genocide. As a kind of bona fide urban Native person, you know, I was born in a rural area and grew up there till I was 18, but I've been in cities now for the majority of my life. And I love living in a city, you know, and I don't feel any less an Anishinaabe living in Toronto than I do when I go back home to the First Nation that I grew up on.
One of the like very firm politics I'm just like unshakable on is that no matter where you are in any place, no matter how deeply concreted it might be, like you're on Indigenous land, period. And there's just no question to me about that. And in the gallery we're in, we're really in like the downtown core of Toronto. Like we're carving out a space to like really examine and focus Indigenous experiences of care, but we're not doing that separate from being on Indigenous land.
Yeah, I mean, this gallery is in the heart of the financial district of Toronto, which is pretty much the economic locus of the Canadian nation state.
So Laura, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the language element that you brought into this show.
It started with doing research on my Dene language, which is a specific Bear Lake dialect. And I've been doing research on it for quite a few years with very limited access to any documentation. And I found through conversation with my biological family that there was no word for care. I ended up spending like days to try and find a way that I could construct a word myself for care. For me, like the language is kind of like family, like they're alive.
I think that's so beautiful. I also think that like by taking on this like immense amount of labor, that you're both educating yourself and doing so much research and speaking to people, you're also in turn like gifting something back to your community. Would you also share a little bit about your paper making process? Because this is like one of my favorite things you did.
The paper is actually made out of old romance erotic novels that are from Native Americans written by white people. I started ripping those up to create the basis of the paper. And what you do is you rip up paper, you can add a bit of cotton, and you have you blend it up in a blender and it becomes pulp, and you go in and you use a mold and you basically just like pick up this pulp and you have to dry it off. But I also added a lot of like sparkle. Like I bought this beautiful like iridescent weird looking fibers, and I wanted all of them to have that.
Yeah, I love that paper. They're already kind of like beautiful pieces of art, and then they're just elevated by this like additional level. Suzanne, would you mind sharing a little bit about your choice of using yarrow plant and the story that you came across?
The Anishinaabe of Treaty Number 3 are medicine people. Like, we are known for our plant medicines, also our animal medicines, but I'm interested in learning about our plant medicines. You know, you can't just bring a plant in and forget about it. It has to be cared for. They have to be nurtured, and you're entered into a relationship with them as soon as you take them with you. So that too I see as symbolic of something important for us as Indigenous women to know, understand, and learn and practice. No matter where we are, we still hold that power to heal ourselves, to heal others through our practices of care and our relationality with each other.
And you were so generous sharing like this knowledge in the show, but also you related yarrow to the other animals and constellations that it's like associated with. And I think that one of the things that stood out to me was the connection between the squirrel and yarrow plant, and it's the squirrel being this like community oriented animal. Everything that you shared for the story, and by bringing the plant in, it just really puts into like a really tangible framework how in relation we are.
The colonial state wants us to buy into this idea that there is a way of being Indigenous that that was at its height at contact, and ever since it's been going down, and we've been further and further away from our indigeneity. To bring it back to the plant, I think there's a teaching in that. I think there's something to think about there, like something really juicy about the idea of this plant being in the gallery and still being able to do all of the things that still being able to offer gifts regardless of being displaced.
Will you share a little bit about our trip to High Park together?
Yeah.
And our endless walk for yarrow?
Emma and I meant to go to High Park to source yarrow. We had this brilliant idea that we would like take the plants from the earth and like bring them to the gallery. It was, I think, the hottest day of the year, like historically maybe one of the hottest days in Toronto. It was like exceedingly sweaty and uncomfortable. You know, we had an idea in our mind that the plant would just like make itself available to us. So
we were like, we're walking into a field of yarrow. We're just going to take our pick, best one we find.
Exactly. So we're looking, and I had, I'd done my research. I knew how to identify it. I don't feel like you trusted me that I did, but I did.
To be fair though, you misidentified.
It's true.
From the get-go.
It's true. This one plant kind of feels special at the same time, I think it worked out the way it was meant to.
Yeah, ancestors were definitely laughing that day.
Yeah.
They knew what they were doing.
There's these two urban Native women trying to find plants.
Who are these two absolute idiots going all the wrong ways?
Right.
Laura, will you talk a little bit about the Mokulito, just like technique that you used for your giant scrolls? Because I know you spent so much time, and I think that we really need to like pay some respect to the physical labor you had to go through for this.
The reason why I also choose printmaking is the same thing of this challenge of being like, you're Indigenous, so you make Indigenous art. And it's like, what does that look like? It obviously looks like what I am doing now. But really just looking at print as this more like relational process that needs to pay more respect to these things that are in it, as well as like trying to push away from it being so institutionalized. The process that I chose is that I have a very deep love for stone lithography, but I don't have access to a stone. And I've came across this process called Mokulito, and it was absolutely like everything just kind of like my brain blew up, and I was like, this is exactly what I was looking for. And I was just I loved it so much. What also they don't tell you is it's the most like painful, finicky process of ever, because it depends on the wood. It depends on the ink, it depends on printing, it depends on the paper, everything. But I wanted to try. I wanted to do this process so bad. You have to use very greasy substances, like tuche. Liquid tuche is a very greasy substance you use to draw on stone. I wanted to do large scale for some reason, just to torture myself some more. But so I had to use like 2 4-foot pieces of plywood to make one image. So I knew that they were going to be fairly inconsistent, but I wanted to show these in large scale to have like a bigger kind of impact. I started back with like things of like, well, what does care marks look like? I just like covered my hands with really greasy tuche and just started doing this like these gestures. And I even did like a physical like hug of this board. And it was also like this relationship with this board all of a sudden. like hugging this board, like scratching, like, you cool. So the whole series has different marks and stories of like my own personal love or self-care or everything.
I was just thinking, I think it's so funny how much labor goes into care. And I hope that this can be felt in this space, in the main gallery space. And I just am like so grateful that you both took time to like work with me on this. So much time, many, many, many months. Thank you both so much.